Hi everyone, this is Mason Winfield with another episode of Psi-Friday with Mason. As it happens to be Friday the 13th, I may just tell you a little bit about it from one perspective. There are many, but I'll tell you about one. You know, I believe the reason Friday the 13th seems so dreadful, so cursed to so many people, I think it goes back in history. I think it goes back to the legendary, fabled Knights Templar. The poor Knights of Christ, the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, were an order of French, mostly French, crusading knights who around 1119, nobody's exactly positive of the year, they approached the king of the Crusades and said, we want to form a sacred order to protect the pilgrims coming to the Holy Land, which we have just slaughtered lots of people to free. And the king said, well, that's a pretty good idea. You guys going to fund it yourself? They did. And a massively important order of warrior knights got started. They were often called the Knights of the Red Cross because their typical garb was a white tunic on top of the armor and a red crucifix. And these guys were not only ferocious, fanatical fighters, but they were the bankers of Europe. They established the first effective system of writing checks and cashing debts, and they really were way ahead of their time. Very brilliant. And a lot of occultism gets attached to them, partly because they are associated with the Temple of Solomon, which did not exist at the time, but they did some poking around in the foundations of this temple when they found where it was. And it may have been something they found in the foundations that gave them the idea to form this squad. For about 150 years, they were really successful, really popular, but their wealth made them enemies because people borrowed from them. And around the early 1300s, King Philip the Fair, Philippe le Bel of France, was starting to think to himself, geez, I owe a lot of money to the Templars. I could pay it back, or I could just kill them. And in an orchestrated move, on Friday the 13th, 1307, the Templar order was surprised, hit, rounded up, thrown in jail. They were never that numerous. They weren't a field army. They were shock troops. So in other words, this wasn't like taking over another country. But Philip the Fair threw a bunch of them in jail, made them confess to blasphemy, made them turn over all their stuff to him. And the stereotype is that he murdered a lot of them. The truth is that a lot of them just did whatever he wanted. They just confessed. They said, okay, yeah, great. We're just banded. Here's the money. A lot of them were never caught. They loaded up their ships with treasure and went somewhere. Where'd they go? That's another big mystery. But I think only 7 of them may have actually been killed, because they were the 7 backbones of the order in 1307, and they just refused to play ball. They may have been burned alive. But you can see why Friday the 13th might have a little bit of mojo. And lastly, I think I might tell you that the Knights Templar were probably not extinguished. They probably just changed their names, did a bunch of different stuff. For instance, there was another knightly order. It was a British order called the Knights Hospitaller. They looked after the hospitals in the Holy Land. And these were bad dudes too. They would have welcomed the Templars. So they probably just changed their name. The theory also is that the Knights Templar are the founding organization of today's Freemasons. I don't think there's good evidence for that. I think there may have been a connection at the root, But I don't think there's one theory for who the Freemasons were. But I think the odds are pretty good that the Knights Templar were involved somehow in the founding of today's Freemasons. I might point out that the Knights Templar were regarded as bankers and warriors, but I think they definitely were into some of the mystical stuff that is so fascinating to the fans of the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. For instance, the Knights Templar were into sacred architecture. They built a lot of their churches with the form of the double cube. And that is a classic sacred shape. My friends, I hope you enjoyed our Friday the 13th, and look forward to seeing you in a week.